Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today at the 2024 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Ophir. I'm a first-year MBA student here at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panel. Evolution of Basketball Analytics, 20 Years of Nerds, Data, and Efficiency. Our panelists today are Dean Oliver, author of Basketball on Paper, Brittany Donaldson, assistant coach of the Atlanta Hawks and co-founder of Strata Athletics, Mike Zarin, VP of Basketball Operations and Team Council at the Boston Celtics, and Allison Pfister, Vice President of Team Operations and Organizational Growth at Boston Celtics. Our panel will be moderated by Ben Alamar, sports analytics author and consultant. The panel will run for 45 minutes, and we will leave 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please submit questions through the Cadence app in the panel pane. Navigate to the panel Evolution of Basketball Analytics, 20 Years of Nerds, Data, and Efficiency event. And questions will be submitted, and then later Ben will see them, and he can ask the panelists. Enjoy. To you, Ben.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, just let's give a hand for these panelists, these real pioneers in our field here. So we're here to talk about the history of basketball analytics, and long before Charles Barkley called analytics stupid, we had pioneers such as Dan Myers, Dan Rosenbaum, Ben Falk, Kevin Pelton, and others were leaning on the work of Bill James, Martin Manley, and others, including coaches such as Dean Smith and Bill Burtka. And we're thinking about the game in a different way. But for the purposes of today, we are going to assume that the beginnings of modern basketball analytics began when the four factors dropped into Dean's brain, which he then graciously shared with all of us in the 2004 publication of Basketball on Paper. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to go through how basketball has changed from a technical side, the data has changed, the things we can do has changed, and how it has impacted the game from players, coaches, and all of that kind of stuff. So here we go. In the early days, so back in 2004 to 2010, this was when people were saying, oh, you're doing Moneyball, but for basketball, right? So during this time, we had the publication of Basketball on Paper. Daryl Morey gets hired by the Rockets, the inaugural Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. Dallas Mavericks hired Roland Beach as the first analytics coach. Michael Lewis published the No Stats All-Star in the New York Times about Shane Battier. And also, Mike Zarin gets hired by the Celtics.
Momentous.
That was before 2004. We're all really old now.
So
Experience.
Thanks.
you don't have to work in a closet anymore, Mike. It's okay. Dean obviously published Basketball on Paper and started to work with the Seattle Supersonics. Allison Pfister was playing in the WNBA, putting up career win shares per 48 of 0.138, which is on par with what LeBron is doing this year and better than Jaylen Brown.
Okay, all right.
And Brittany Donaldson was gunning it for Northern Iowa with a three-point attempt rate of .64, in line with Max Strus and obliterating Trae Young's .46.
Okay.
I won't tell him that.
Well, but now let's turn to the panelists. So
You should definitely tell him.
So we'll start with Dean. So Dean, tell me, what was it like to have all of basketball analytics magically appear in your brain and have you transcribe it for us in Basketball on Paper?
Hey, that was not a prep question.
Yeah, I got a couple surprises today.
No, I'd thought about this since Bill James in the 80s, and I love basketball. So what I thought about all the time was basketball, and my brain is wired for numbers. So really what happened was when I was in college, I spent some time just kind of writing down what happens in a basketball game, and when you write it on those old line pieces of paper, it gives it a natural structure. So this possession to this possession to this possession, and it helped win me a couple NCAA tournament things that I bet on at the time, but I knew it had a lot of structure. So I did that. The four factors actually came out of having to estimate how many possessions were in a game because I couldn't chart everything. How do you estimate it? And so you come up with an estimation formula, and that there were four factors that were in that equation that I realized, oh, That's how you get better.
There you go. There you go. All right, so Mike, what was, when you were getting started, what were the tools, what was basketball analytics like, and what were the first big sort of epiphanies that you had out of the data?
I mean, all we had was box scores, and nobody was really using them, you know, in a collective way across games other than just averages. I remember the first year's, it was the fall of '03, and we called someone at the NBA and said, do you have the files that are the output of the substitutions in the game so we could look at what the sub patterns were for different teams? And nobody had ever called and asked for that before. They were stored somewhere after the game, but nobody knew where they were. We sort of thought that the draft might be some low-hanging fruit. So I was an intern. We called the NCAA, and they said, yeah, we have the season-level box score for every team going back to 1983, but it's on paper. So they faxed us like 1,200 pages, some enormous number of pages of very small print box scores. And I was an intern, but I was allowed to hire an intern, and we typed all of those into a computer to make the draft model that we were building at the time. But really, the biggest epiphany was just getting people to think in terms of per possession instead of per game. I think all of us would probably say that that's sort of the biggest early change, was thinking about that. But the logistical challenges when nothing was computerized were somewhat extreme.
So they had those files. I remember learning later that they had the files on some website, but very few people knew about them.
Yeah, there was an internal NBA website that wasn't password protected, so actually anyone could go to it. But nobody knew it was there. And you still have to click on each of them. You still have to click on each one of them. It was not.
Yes.
Things are worked really
It
differently.
was better
now.
than doing 1,400 pages of
typing them in.
facts.
Yeah, that was bad. Yeah. That was bad. Back in my day, everything was on paper.
Dean, Mike, and I are very old, so
We're
forgive
really
us.
Old now.
But now, Allison, you were coming this from a different perspective. You were a player at the time. Yeah. So what was your first exposure to sort of non-traditional box score data? What, how'd that come about? What did it mean anything to you when we started talking about per possession stuff?
So I'd probably say when I got to the Celtics, because that was really my first foray in professional basketball, outside of work at the NBA. No, potentially at the NBA.
You play for like
I did, but
a very long time.
He said advanced stats.
Okay.
In any case, at the NBA, we did work in the NBA G League, identifying players for the, I guess, precursor to the draft combine, where we had, I can't remember, Elite Camp is what it's called. But as a player, the box score stats were really flat, and although we preached every possession matters, never had any advanced stat to indicate really why. I will be the first to say that I'm stating it here at Sloan that I was the first person to say 3 is more than 2. I would always shoot pull-up threes in transition, and so yeah, that's really my first exposure.
All right. And now, Brittany, you were in high school as Dean is starting this revolution. You were a basketball player. You were a math nerd. Like, did you see a connection at the time? How did that you evolve into something like this?
Yeah, I don't think so, at least not like consciously. Yeah. My dad coached me pretty much my whole life, even through high school, and I think at times he would give me like statistical goals to have or motivators, whether it was, as a point guard, so hey, try and get like 4 or 5 rebounds. I think that really helps us when our guards rebound. Assist to turnover ratio was certainly something that was pounded into my head as a point guard in high school, but I certainly wasn't thinking about, expected shot quality or points per possession or anything like that, but maybe in the depths of my consciousness, something was there.
Well, you knew threes were good. That was
I
clear
did know
from the
that.
data.
I did shoot a lot of those.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I may though, in Europe we did use I don't even know what it's called, but in Spanish it was valoración, where, can you translate that for me, brother?
We're gonna have to separate these.
Yeah. Sibling squabbles here. It's okay.
Speaks totally fluent Spanish and English, but it's okay.
Right.
I think it's valuation.
Thank you, valuation. I could forget those sometimes. But it showed the impact of certain stats would have on a game, and particularly as a post player, we noticed that for post players, this valoración would be much higher than it would be for a guard, just generally speaking. But I think that's probably my first time, yeah, really considering how a lot of different stats had an impact on a game.
And I mean, NBA efficiency is a very similar stat that the NBA was touting widely in the early 2000s. Really similar, just add up the box score stats, and the big
Did you
people
call my
always
stat primitive? Is that what you're trying to say?
I mean, then it was, yeah.
Okay.
You've seen the stuff we have now.
For sure.
But
Calm down.
yeah, adding the box score stats together was an interesting way to sort of just decide, a rebound is worth the same as an assist, is worth the same as a point.
Yeah.
It was quickly obvious to those of us working in this that wasn't a really smart way to value players.
True.
So, and this is for anybody who's got a notion around this, was there something that you saw in the data, the early days, that you thought, wow, that's different, that's changing basketball, and then like with a little better data, a little more experience, like, well, it turns out that was not quite as clear as I thought it was?
Okay, look at me. I think Daryl said it at one point, that there are times where you feel like you are doing that, but it turns out a lot of things have been traditional in basketball. They are the right things, like valuing the possession. I think probably the best example that I can come up with is some of the Carmelo Anthony stuff. So some of the models that I was using had Melo not nearly as good as, of course, reputation, but also worse than the newer models that came after that. So Melo obviously was beaten around a bit by analytics, but he probably shouldn't have gotten beat around as much.
Now, Brittany, you've been obviously player, coach, seen a lot of different things. Was there a significant, time where you remember a major misuse of data from a coach, like trying to make a point and like just talked about something entirely like you're like, oh my God?
Yeah, definitely. And not just coaches. I think even, if I see something on Twitter, sometimes I'm like, oh my God.
Wait, things are wrong.
Yeah, I mean, an example that always comes to mind is lineup data. I think you have to be really delicate with lineup data, especially in small sample sizes. And there's just so much context that's missing from lineup data, whether it's matchups or what types of actions we are running, what coverages we were in when that lineup was on the floor. There's just a lot of context that's typically missing. So, a lot of times lineup data by itself, especially in small samples, isn't that indicative of anything. That's probably the one I see most misused.
Oh, that's
So the one that I think about on that front
That's good to know.
is a long time ago people were talking. They would emphasize, some of the coaches I knew, they would emphasize gang rebounding by saying defensive rebounding is the most important stat in the game. Because if you look at a simple relationship between who wins defensive rebounds and who wins the game, it's very, very high. But it's just as a result of forcing more missed shots. And so when I heard it from a coach using that to emphasize it, it did make me cringe a little bit.
One of my first meetings with a high-level Celtics coach, I won't say which one, one of the lower-level people in that coaching staff is now a head coach and was listening to me a lot. It was cool to interact with him. But the higher-up coach, that year we were #1 in defensive field goal percentage. And we went into him to try and say, we just decided to totally pack the paint that season and give up a ton of threes. And if you looked at effective field goal percentage, we were actually 10th, not first. And the instant response was, well, the point of the game is to score baskets, right?
Yeah.
I say, well, no, it's actually to outscore the other team. They're not all worth the same. That didn't go over well at the start.
That didn't work.
We were #1 in the league at defensive field goal percentage. We have the best defense. Not quite right.
Don't get me started on individual defensive stats.
Oh, yeah.
That's, we all know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a good jumping point because they were really bad and then they got just to be bad once we had data, right? We had optical tracking data. And that sort of fundamentally changed what was possible from a basketball analytics perspective. So from 2010 to 2016, we saw Stats LLC put cameras first in a couple of arenas, including Dallas, Boston, and OKC, and then eventually all 30 arenas. We had the father of PER, John Hollinger. He gets hired by the Grizzlies.
He's here somewhere.
We had, John's here probably. Second Spectrum is founded during this period of time, and which was actually birthed out of the research paper competition here at Sloan. And really, player tracking data changed a lot. Brittany, you were at Stats. What were some of the questions that when you actually got your hands on that data that you thought you could tackle? What were the first things you wanted to work on that you couldn't do before this?
Yeah, there were a lot of things that we couldn't do before that. I remember one of the first projects that slid across my desk was actually from the NBA, and it was a project they were doing around All-Star Weekend. They wanted to basically, send out some infographics on social media about the dunk contest, and so all the contestants from that year, they sent us a bunch of video of their best dunks, and they wanted us to use the tracking data to calculate a bunch of stuff like hang time and who had the most force throwing the ball into the net. So I had to dust off my physics cap and calculate this stuff, which was pretty cool. And it was the really fun dunk contest in 2016. It was the Aaron Gordon, Zach LaVine dunk contest. It was the awesome dunk contest. So
Not this year's? No?
yeah, no. This year's was all right. So that was, stuff like that where just fan engagement was changing. The types of stuff we could share with fans was changing. And then also, obviously, on the team side, I would get a lot of requests around strategy. And, there's just so much more information now we have around what happens between the events that you see in the play-by-play. So now instead of, knowing that you're number one in pace and how pace was defined back in the day, just a possession game, now, teams were asking us questions like, okay, how are we fast? What time do we actually cross the court in the shot clock? Do we pass the ball ahead or do we dribble it ahead? When this player pushes it, is it different than when this player pushes it? And what are the results of those possessions? And everything from how many players should we send to the offensive glass? 2, 3, 4? What's the risk versus reward when we do those things? So it was a lot of interesting questions, and through that experience, I got to understand what teams and specifically coaching staffs really cared about.
It was totally impossible to speak a coach's language with data until we had the tracking.
Yeah.
You look at the box score and you can't say what happened in a game by looking at the box score. I just remember going to the first practice that I went to, and I'd been going to every Celtics game forever, and they were just speaking a different language. And they weren't just speaking a different language from the language I might speak going in there. They're also speaking a different language than we could possibly have the data speak. And so the tracking just really, really changed the world for all of us doing this stuff.
And I think one of the fundamental things that's missing from the box score and the play-by-play is a lot of defense too.
Yeah.
So matchups, any of that sort of thing, any kind of help defense, none of that was possible until that came out.
If you've been to a basketball practice, think of the things the coaches tell the players, other than take that shot or don't take that shot. It's pretty much not in the box score.
Yep.
The things that you're telling the players to do. So we need to get the tracking. Nobody wanted to put chips in the players' shoes. I said that at the first conference and got in a lot of trouble. And so we had to do cameras.
So we had this explosion of data. Dean, how did you, and obviously lots of ideas flood your brain immediately when you see what's possible. How do you figure out what to do first?
You address the questions that people will pay attention to, which is whether that's preparing for an opponent or building your own guys. It's what is most important to our people. And I was always not driven by what is necessarily in that data, but knowing what's there and then understanding the questions that our coaches would have. And that was the best way to do it.
Yeah, the other immediate thought was hire some smarter people than me. So we went and did that.
So you got it in
They exist?
before they did the second spectrum machine learning, right?
We put cameras in during playoff games in 2010. So that was the first real NBA game. There were they had the cameras in the stadium in Chicago, but the Bulls didn't know they were on, and it was a whole thing. We were the first team to get some tracking data.
Rubble.
Yeah.
And it was very messy. The players would teleport back and forth. They would be wrongly identified and stuff. But instantly we figured out how far guys were running during the game, and we're able to change the training right away. And that was it took a couple days to get the data back, but you need just different skill sets to deal with continuous motion spatial data. It's just not the same. So
Speaking of needing different skill sets, Second Spectrum came in and we had player tracking data. We had some interesting things coming out of stats, but Second Spectrum developed something that was completely and totally different. So how did that, what they were doing, tell us, sort of describe what that looked like, and then why was that so fundamentally, such a big step forward?
You're all looking at me. So.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the biggest thing was instantly you could teach a computer to recognize the movements in the game that the coaches were talking about. And Rajiv and Yuhan, who founded Second Spectrum, were experts at taking motion data and doing machine learning on it, and also big basketball fans. And so they were smart enough. First, they did a rebounding paper here, and people really liked it. And so they were smart enough to put together a company to do that. And the first question they asked us, we were one of their first clients, was what are the things in the game that you guys care about? And if you've ever been around a basketball team, there's a really lot of those things. There's like so many things. So it was great to tell them what those things were, but then they're like, okay, well, show us 20 plays where that happens. Yeah. And so credit to Drew Cannon on our staff, among other people, who spent a lot of time QAing some of the early Second Spectrum products. David Sparks too some, but Drew spent a lot of time doing early QA for Second Spectrum, saying, all right, this is an under, this is a blitz, this is a show. And over time, the machines get smart, and now they can recognize all those things really fast. And there have been changes in data provided. First, Second Spectrum was working with stats camera data, then their own camera data, now Hawkeye camera data. But we do this. This work happens really quickly now. At the start, it wasn't so easy, but suddenly, when the coaches say, "All right, we want a play that involves a pin down over here," we can see when that happened in games and how useful it was and how effective it was and who defended it well and so on and so forth.
And the data is not perfect. It's good. It's much better than it used to be. But you still find plenty of cases where a coach is like, well, that's not actually, no, it didn't go under or didn't go, like, that's not what we would call it. But it was so much better.
Every one of us up here has had to fight the, well, that play is coded wrong, therefore it's all crap problem.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Well, I think that's why incorporating video was such a huge breakthrough with this data. Being able to select whatever play, action, with whatever filters you want, and to watch all the video and select the ones that are correct and show those to the coach, But that, to me, was one of the biggest, I guess, innovations in this space, too.
Yeah, it was really, I did that with a player. We're sitting there and like just going through everything and like, oh, okay, I actually had you matched up on the wrong player. Yep. And they're like, oh, okay, so how does my game score effectively change if you have me matched up on the right guy? And like, so they actually started to understand the value of having right data, and it's one possession over the 50 that he was in the game. And they're like, oh, okay, it doesn't make that big a difference. So they get a little more comfortable with that. So
Allison, as either in your playing or as you start working with players in the NBA, like what is the reaction from players to this kind of new view of how good they are based on this data and a bunch of nerds crunching things?
I think there's some resistance initially because of the way you feel on the court, the lack of self-awareness potentially on what you think you're good at, and where are the areas of opportunity in your play. Dean and I were having a conversation backstage just about players in this age are growing up in the age of data and analytics, so they are much more well versed than the coaches in a lot of senses. I played for Orlando Woolridge, for Muggsy Bogues, for Michael Cooper. Their box score, flat box score. Yep. Our guys are playing for Joe Mazzulla, Will Hardy, and so many others, Quinn Snyder, who see the value in exploiting the data and to glean the competitive advantage. So, they're receptive. They're receptive.
And have you? Sounds like you've seen a change in how that's progressed over the years as the field has matured, coaches are different. Is that?
I won't say it's easy. I think little by little, when you see how analyzing data and implementing it can impact winning, gradually you want to be the best you can be and maximize your opportunities on the court. It's not easy. It's you might think that driving to the basket with your right hand, which is your not not your dominant hand 25 times a year is, something that's beneficial for the team, but the numbers might show something starkly different. It's hard to change those habits, short term, but over time, yes.
So a couple questions from the audience as we go through this. So,
is anybody asking about the secret handshake between Brittany and Michael?
No.
No? Okay.
no?
No.
But somebody can ask that, and then we can force them to do it. So it's okay. Let's see here. What's something you were?
Secret mean anything to you?
What's something you were confident?
Secret for you two, not for me and Nate.
You do it in front of people. We know.
It's
All right,
not a
all
secret.
right.
What's something you were confident would change the game or have some kind of impact, but it didn't work? Like it didn't land, and people didn't use it, or it was just wrong.
Taking
tough one.
shots
That's
without
a tough one.
Right
passing.
about everything, I guess. So
I know.
that's good.
That's a tough one. Yeah, that's really hard.
All
Can
right.
you repeat that question again?
Yeah. So, what is
Please.
something that you thought was going to change the game, but didn't work out?
I don't know. This is something might not even be relevant to the question, but I remember a conversation I was having with one of my colleagues around teams that just shoot threes indiscriminately without factoring in what it's like to be one of those players who never touches the ball when you're doing that. I personally don't think that's I know there are a lot of people that advocate for just jacking threes all the time, but sometimes other players want to be in the flow, even if analytically speaking it might be advantageous or favorable, but there are other factors to consider that are as important.
I think it gets at one of the communication challenges with the whole shoot layups and threes. It doesn't mean you shoot only those.
Yeah.
And you have to communicate. And they ask what the right rate of shooting mid-range twos versus others. I'm like, it's not as though we can give you that. And I don't want you thinking too much in a game. I want you to recognize what you're good at. And hopefully we do that in practice to give you that kind of judgment.
To Allison's point, like not every three is equal. It's not, and if, to your point, I'm running up and down the court for 5 straight possessions, don't touch the ball, like I might not run back on defense as hard the next possession. And there's just ripple effects that we don't really know. Your defense might suffer because you're shooting more threes, but not everybody's touching the ball. That's just an example. So not, treating every shot attempt, every three-point shot equally.
We also, just totally unrelated, but another answer to the question. We thought in the 2000 teens, there was like this VR explosion. Everybody had a headset. And a lot of people were thinking that, we're going to just train with these VR headsets on. And none of them could really process data fast enough for people to use them while moving. It was like, quarterbacks were good because they could survey the field and then throw. But you couldn't come off a screen wearing one. And, people get dizzy, and we tried one out where all the users were getting nauseous, like dizzy and nauseous, running around wearing these headsets. That hasn't. I think that might be coming, but definitely hasn't changed the game yet.
Yeah.
Is there footage of you in the VR?
I didn't try. Not to run.
I need to get
I
that.
looked around.
Can that be your headshot?
Right, exactly.
All right. So player tracking data matures. It starts being used. There's in college games some. There's in the next WNBA season. It's going to be in all WNBA games. It was used during the playoffs last year. It's in a lot of G League games. We're now Hawkeye, where you got 20 to 30 data points on a body being tracked instead of just a pinpoint. And then also over the last few years, we've got things like Clean the Glass debuted, Her Hoop Stats. We've got women's college basketball being populated in Basketball Reference, which allows me to understand Brittany's game a little better. So, Brittany, as a coach, as these data resources have matured and become more available, what are the most important tools, stats that came online for working with and developing players? How has that engagement with those players changed given with that data?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think to be clear, like we're still at a point where we're not really, on-court player development and data aren't like working directly with each other a whole lot. Like I'm not going to the players directly with data a ton. There's a few reasons for that. One being like, I don't know if the technology is quite there yet. You mentioned biomechanical data. I think that's going to be really useful in player development and like real time, getting real time feedback, particularly with shooting at some point in time, but we're not there yet. But I think the other reason is like presenting data isn't always the best teaching tool or coaching tool. And I guess an analogy would be like, if I told Mike, hey, I think you would perform better if you drank 20 ounces of water a day. Well, I think, first of all, he'd be like,
He does.
who the fuck are you to tell me that? You know? But I think,
That's not a 20 ounces, not enough.
no, I don't even know what 20, yeah, you're right. What is 20 ounces? What is that compared to what I normally drink? What is that? Is that a lot? I don't know. The second option would be like to tell you to drink 2 bottles of water every day. Okay, it's a little more digestible. I still don't really know. Will you actually do it? I don't know. But if you're talking about like changing behavior, like this is a human being. If I just didn't tell you anything about how much water you should drink and I just put a water jug in your office, like you're probably going to drink more water. So the same way in coaching, like it's not always like, hey, X player, you're this much better when you go left versus right off the pick and roll, shoot a 3. It's more so about, as coaches, like using the data, using the insights to design the environment for the player, whether that's in the game. If that's the stat I'm using as an example, like you're much more efficient off the dribble 3 going left than you are right, we can draw up plays to get you going to your left, or we can ensure that maybe you're on the right side of the court more, so when you receive a pick and roll or get a handoff, you're going to your left. In training sessions, that could look like, you know, I'm teaching you different reads to get you to your left hand more often. Maybe if you come off to your right and they go under and you're tempted to shoot, maybe I teach you that the big's going to re-screen and flip the screen, and now you're going to come back to your left. So it's kind of designing the environment. It's like a little bit of behavioral science, honestly. To me, like that's more impactful, a more impactful way to use data in player development than to just give the players numbers all the time. There are players that want the numbers sometimes, but not everybody does, and I'm trying to think more about holistically, how can I coach better, how can I influence more behavior, optimize on efficiency.
Fundamentally, a lot of practice, like we don't get great data. We think about all the great data that we get out of games, but in practice, they're shooting, a lot of these guys who shoot 3 shots a game, they're shooting hundreds in practice. And we have actually a lot on shots, but we don't have a lot on the rest of practice.
Right.
And so it's not really a controlled experiment. You're talking about, yeah, the integration is not there because it's hard to record what every coach is doing with every player to see whether that helps them.
Yeah, the other issue with our sport, in comparison to some other sports, and you talk to the European soccer people, and they're just astonished at this, is how little we actually practice at all.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, during the month of January, I think we had, what, 3 practices?
Very few.
Now, that's for the guys who play a lot. For the guys who don't play a lot, they're doing a lot more on the off days to stay ready. But, you know, you talk to these soccer teams, and they have a whole periodized practice schedule of drills for every day during the week. And if you're lucky enough to play 2 games a week, that's a busy schedule. And I'm like, well, we got 5 games in 7 nights in 5 cities. There's not going to be any practice. So it's hard. A lot of the data has to come from the games, and the games are, you know, you don't get to see all the things that you want your team to do in the games because you know, you're trying to win the game. And so that challenge hasn't changed with more data.
So, Allison, team building is incredibly complex. It's hard to get the right team together, match skill sets, all of that. How has your process, your strategy, your view around that evolved with data and the impact of that?
You know, I am super fortunate to work with the smartest man in basketball. So
That's Brad, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, Brad is smart.
and
Brad.
exactly.
Brad.
It's changed because when I was a player and before I joined and became Mike Zarin's colleague, I knew very little about the draft models and all that goes into prospecting and identifying talent. That's from a roster building standpoint. From a team building standpoint, I think that's an area left largely unexploited, and could be tapped in, if there were variables to identify that would, lend itself to, hey, identifying certain players based on culture and what kind of teammate they might be, would be lovely. And even like the rate of player development in terms of players are leaving college at 19 years old. What rate of development might they realize a certain potential where they, develop into hopefully an NBA roster player or a starter or so have you. So
that's a really interesting question to me. So we use basketball to evaluate players' performance all the time. And how do we use it to better develop players? How has basketball development for these guys changed, given that we can measure their actual skill sets and their actual development so much better than we used to be able to do?
Well, I'll promote a little bit of the book that I've got coming out in the fall.
There we go.
There is
Plug one.
Thank you for the feed right there. Yeah, I have a chapter kind of on how you do some player development, how you identify better goals for certain players using some of the stats, identifying what is a better path and I wrote about it, I don't know, a month or so ago with regard to Detroit and what they were doing with Jaden Ivey, and were they developing him the right way? And it didn't appear that way based upon, if you try to make a projection of his future using those stats, the way he was playing was not appropriate for him to develop. So there are ways to do that, and I spell it out more in the book. There you go, twice.
There's also like a big range of basketball skills that we just couldn't track before.
For sure.
So are you a good screen setter? We would watch a bunch of tape and decide if you were a good screen setter or not. But even if you set really hard screens, maybe you weren't locating them right. Maybe you weren't, maybe you were a point guard not waiting for the screen to get set. There's like 50 things we can check now and tell you you're actually better at this now. Yep. You're getting better at it. Let's aim for 3 more of these a game. And you don't have to have someone go and look for each instance of it on the film and then cut the tape up and bring it to, because you can only do 2 or 3 of those for any given game. Now you can do tons of them. And so if any skill you actually care about in the game, it's much, much easier to develop if the guy's playing, because you actually can tell the computer to go find all the instances of it and see how well you've done at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but those guys who sit on the bench, it's a real tough question, because those guys sitting there, you don't get that game day.
Yeah, there's some practice facility systems in place. A lot of places that are doing more tracking there, and that area is getting better, but it's still not what it could be. And the drills are often not super structured in practice, so that's hard to teach a computer to track if you haven't structured it nicely. So.
And when you're on the road, you're not.
When you're on the road, you set up some system in whatever random gym you happen to be practicing in. It's hard.
Yeah.
Very hard.
All right. So this is a question I'm going to ask each of you for an example here. Which players pre-2004 would have benefited the most from playing in the basketball the more analytics era? Whoever has one first.
Well, you just told me that I'm comparable to Jaylen Brown.
Better than Jaylen Brown.
And better than Jaylen Brown, and probably deserving of a $300 million contract.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Allison was my answer.
I think I would too. I shot a lot of threes.
She did lead the nation in scoring in college.
I did.
Pretty good.
Thank you, Michael.
No worries, I got you. I got you.
That's a good question. I'm going to leave it to some of the more experienced, older.
The older guys.
I mean,
That's fine.
I'll pick some old Celtics, not to promote the old boss so much, but Danny just didn't shoot enough threes, and now he would. Mm-hmm. And he was one of the best in the league at that at the time in the late 80s. I mean, you think about the fact, what was the most threes Larry Bird shot in a season? Not very many.
No.
And so those guys would have been even better than they already were in the modern era. I mean, threes versus twos is like the easiest example everyone in this room probably uses for the impact of this stuff. Yep. But when you're looking at eras where people didn't shoot a lot of threes, there the impact would have been really big.
Yeah. Brittany, does anybody come to mind?
I'll answer the reverse question of who would struggle.
Yes, that's where I'm going next. Go ahead.
But have Dean answer first, because I think you might have
I'll pull up, I'll follow on with kind of the shooters. I think Reggie Miller and Ray Allen, as great as they were, they would have been even more powerful if they were allowed to do all of that. But the more obscure name I thought about when you first brought this up a while ago was Brad Lohaus. Because Brad Lohaus was a shooting big before shooting bigs were really kind of embraced. He wasn't great defensively, but he could. But he would have been
Old
more
Celtic
than.
references.
I
Love it.
thought you would like that one.
Throwback.
I thought you were going to steal that one actually when you said Celtics.
All right, so Brittany, for the reverse of the current players, pre-analytic, move them all the way back before there were analytics. Who would benefit from that?
Well, I think like the Taco Falls and the Bobons of the world would obviously thrive. They're not chasing anybody off any screens or having to be up and pick and roll and aggressive. You know, they just hang out in the paint for the most part. So those are my two.
Yeah, well, you think about a guy like Roy Hibbert who went through the transition and was very valuable, and then suddenly not nearly as valuable. Those big guys. It's funny, we got sort of a renaissance of big guys coming in the NBA right now, but they're more versatile than the ones were then. Yeah.
All right, so.
No, I got nothing.
So despite Charles Barkley's claim that analytics is just made-up term and they don't actually work, clearly basketball analytics has grown both from technical depth and impact on the game. So let's talk about what's next. We got AI coming, we got better data, what's possible. So again, for all of you, what would you say are the next set of tools that are coming that are going to have significant impact on any part of the game?
I mean, the pose data.
Yeah.
Pose data. So we're getting 22 body parts at 60 hertz now. Since 2000, some number 10, 12, 13, we've been getting 30 or 20 frames a second, one center of mass dot for each guy. Now we actually can do the skeletal stuff. And so all the biomechanical applications you might imagine, how to jump better, how to block shots better, how to shoot better, all of those things, how to train better, which muscles are you using when you do X, and how do we train those, all of that stuff is, we've got, 5 months of that data now, and of varying levels of quality, it's getting better. And so, that's a whole other world. We for a long time, we sent our guys somewhere at the start of the season and had them put the video game white dots on them, and they would jump, and we would measure their jumping technique and stuff. And now we're getting that data constantly during the game. And so it's just that there's a whole range of physiological stuff to do there that we've barely begun to tap.
Do you think that will ever be used to predict or indicate fouls on the court, for example? Like the physics of SQBR?
I expect, somewhere Monty's laughing in the back of the room.
I
I expect, Monty McCutcheon's here somewhere. I expect a bunch of automated officiating to happen pretty quickly in the next few years. We'll see what happens, but
Not from fouls, though, really.
maybe not foul. Fouls is hard. That's more subjective.
But it's subjective. But if you could determine,
Would you want that as a next player? Would you
just
want a
asking.
computer calling the foul on you?
the times players say, one, say they don't commit a foul, and two, say I want the foul.
Do you think they would complain any less if the computer called the foul? I don't think so.
So I don't know.
So Brittany, any big predictions for what's coming?
Yeah, I mean, there's always an intrigue about decision making in basketball, and both how do we teach that more effectively and how do we measure that. I'm always thinking about designing drills and whatever to teach it better and to set up situations where players can perceive things easier and faster. And so I'm always interested in like what the players are looking at when they're on the court, and I think the pose data might kind of help with that. Like where's their head at? I don't know, but like we need to know what they're looking at. Like there are like eye tracking goggles out there that can give you that sort of data. I don't think we're going to put eye tracking goggles on our players, but it's really, really interesting to think about. And if we could, I don't know, come up with some sort of tool that would help us with that. But then the other thing I think about all the time is like coaching analytics. So trying to evaluate as staff what we spend the most time on in practice and film sessions, what we spend the most time discussing. When we work on those things, is it an introduction? Are we talking about it, teaching it, or are the players actually competing? Are they learning? what level of teaching are we doing when we're working on these skills, and how often? Like, I think so often we think we're working on defense or think we're working on offense, but really like it's like 80-20 is the ratio that we spend on these things. So just having a better idea of what we spend our time on, and then how that's playing out in the game, and how we can maximize our time with our players.
Yeah, some of this is data. I mean, that is data, like just getting track of what we focused on in practice. And you can kind of get that out of a practice plan.
A little.
Like, okay, but it's
We don't always
terrible
follow
to
that.
Oh, I know.
Follow the
I
Go
know.
off. Yeah.
That's for sure. But what
Yeah.
Mike is talking about is a lot of data. But I think there's a critical thing is what are these going to answer? What is the question that you're going to answer with all of this? Because how you evaluate coaches, a piece of data on its own is not going to answer that.
Right.
You've got to put it together with, well, what are we trying to do? And did it have a result that we can measure?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of broaden what Britt is saying too, I think there's a big bunch of neurological decision-making, brain science stuff coming down the pike from fields other than sports that we'll get to use, that will really change how we both evaluate and train athletes. I don't think that's just a basketball thing.
Allison, is there something from a culture that you talk about, sort of culture and leadership and things, like is there measurements there that you can imagine that would be, useful in how we look at these players and our teams?
None come to mind. I'm imagining some indicator that would be beneficial with the amount of books we're reading, with the amount of leadership consultants we lean on to help shape our ideologies around our programs. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but would be definitely beneficial.
But I think there's like a common fallacy in that question, which is we meet with guys and interview them and talk to them and talk to their teammates and their coaches and their friends, and we learn things about them. That's all data. It's not numbers.
But you don't necessarily know how all of that's going to fit, and sometimes
no doubt.
we lean heavier on the basketball-related data than we do on the, I guess, the qualitative data.
If that's true, it's a big change in
Yes.
the last 20 years.
That may be the
We've
most
done
fundamental change, if
We
that's true.
certainly, I know we've made,
If that's
maybe
true,
not
it's
us
a
in
big
general,
change.
but I know that decisions are made. Sometimes we forego what we know about this qualitative piece because of,
We shouldn't.
and we should
Totally
not,
right.
because there's
Absolutely.
You want to find out what pieces of information best predict outcomes that you care about. Sometimes that's going to be a number. Sometimes it's going to be something else.
yeah.
And those things, I mean, one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about, and I don't know how good we are at it, but we spend a lot of time thinking about it, and we get asked this all the time, how do you weigh A versus B, where B is something, 3-point percentage adjusted for some sample size with some confidence interval and all these fancy statistical things we can do, versus the fact that that the people around this guy are bad people.
Yeah.
And it's hard to, those are just examples of things, right? So that's not easy, but you can't tell me that second thing isn't something that will help predict whether or not this guy's going to be successful in the NBA. Or maybe you can tell me that and then we can go test it and see. But you need to be able to have some process by which you evaluate the reliability of that set of data and then the utility of that set of data, just like you would with 3-point percentage.
And it depends on the system, like this individual systems.
All right. So Dean, what would Dean from 2004 be most surprised by in how basketball analytics has evolved?
The speed that we had in effect, the fact that we changed the game in a lot of ways with a lot of help from Steph Curry, don't get me wrong. But yeah, the fact that the game is played differently, more optimally in a lot of ways, that's what I'm blown away. When I got into the league, I never would have imagined that we would have changed this much, this fast.
Two more audience questions here. So you talked about the worst stats that you've heard coaches use too much. What are the most underutilized ones that you like for everybody?
I'm answering that question.
Mike, you have an opinion?
Joe knows. Joe knows.
Yeah, I got competitors up here. I can't be.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. All right, then I'll go to this last question from the audience. So, Mike, this is for you.
Okay.
For all the impact that analytics has had on the game, and given his role as an innovator and practitioner in the field for over 20 years, when do you think Dean will be inducted to the Basketball Hall of Fame?
That's a good question.
Wow, that's a good question.
I didn't plant that.
I appreciate you writing in that question, Dean. I was asked by some journalists earlier this year, who's the Bill James of basketball, and I first wanted to actually say Bill James, who this room is named after. He's not here this year, but we all in this room owe Bill an enormous debt of gratitude. Both these guys worked at Stats, and Darryl worked there.
I didn't work there.
I thought you did something with.
I corresponded a lot with him.
So you corresponded a bunch with Bill.
Yeah.
You worked there. Darryl worked there, and none of us. This whole revolution would not have happened without him. So we all owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. But if it's not Bill James, who's the Bill James of basketball, because he was mostly writing about baseball, it's Dean. And so I don't. The Hall of Fame voting committee might have to change its makeup a little bit before they want to recognize this stuff.
Contributor.
But he certainly contributed. There's no doubt.
Wow.
I don't know when.
I don't know when either.
So
We'll see.
there's
Could be.
If ever.
campaign to get started there. Hashtag
Wow.
Dean Hall of Fame. So that's
I will say we haven't, the crazy thing about this, I've said this before, the kids who were watching Steph are just sort of coming up now.
Oh, yeah.
So we actually, to the point you were asking Allison about earlier, I think the set of knowledge and curiosity in the locker room about this stuff is going to be really different in the NBA in 5 to 10 years. It needs to be a whole different type of player who is used to quickly looking at video of things they care about in the game.
Yeah.
And when we started, there was nothing like that.
It's already happening. My daughter, a recruiting tool is to send data around what, the rosters for each team that she's considering, and, how she would potentially fit.
Allison's daughter's like the #1 recruit in the country.
He's on my PR team. No, but honestly, they're trying to show her how she might fit in a system based on her, profile, given the profile of the other players. So it's already happening.
The players really know a lot, and they're going to be the next wave of coaches too, and so they are going to be teaching a lot of the analytics to the next wave of NBA players too. So it's happening.
The middle school game, I saw a warm-up line for threes the other day. So it's a different world. All right, so got about 90 seconds left here. Closing thoughts from each of you. This has been a massive change over the last 20 years. What we can do, we've talked about it, we've touched on a lot of it. We weren't able to touch on a lot of it because we only have an hour. What is the one thing that is truly, I asked Dean what would be most surprising, but most impactful to you about data in the game of basketball today?
I'm going to cede my time to the GOAT.
No.
So what's this question?
What is the one thing that's
We'll use the 90
most
seconds for
impactful?
that.
What has been most impactful here in the field that maybe we haven't touched on too much today?
Yeah, we've touched on a lot of the important
It's
things.
all in his book.
Yeah.
Look at the number, but look at the number of people's lives who've been changed by this stuff.
We have a lot of people working
It's
in
freaking
this.
amazing. There's half the room here are people working in sports stats now, and that there's a whole industry. We have this conference.
And I remember when it was
about
just
the first
us.
conference. We took all the basketball people at the first conference out to dinner afterwards. It was 8 of us at the Fours. I mean, this is I'm just blown away by the community that's developed around this. Never mind the impact it's actually had on the broader game that so many people around the world care about. It's really, really neat to be a part of it. And I'm just super, super lucky.
I think that's a
That's a
great
mic
point
drop.
to end on. It's been a wild ride and a great ride with a lot of amazing people. So thank you, everybody. Great time.